I've been driving through the night, making my way along a long stretch of highway through Kansas, flat fields on either side, nothing but black sky and the hum of my rig. It was just past 3 a.m., and I was running behind schedule, so I kept my foot steady on the gas. No one else was on the road, just me and my load of equipment bound for Oklahoma. That's when I hit something. There was a heavy thud under the front wheels, followed by a sickening crunch as whatever it was rolled underneath the trailer. I slammed on the brakes, my truck jerking to a stop. My heart was pounding. I sat there for a second, gripping the steering wheel, telling myself it was probably just some debris, a blown tire, or a chunk of wood that had fallen off of another truck. But the sound it made was different. It sounded bigger, heavier. I put the truck in park, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the cold night. The wind was picking up, a low whistle across the empty plains. I didn't see anything right away, just the black road stretching out in both directions, vanishing into the darkness. I walked to the front of the truck, shining my light on the asphalt. No sign of debris, no stray tires or dead animals. But when I got back to the trailer, I froze. There, lying just under the edge of the trailer, was a figure. A body. My breath caught in my throat. For a second, I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then slowly, I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight shaking as I trained it on the shape. It was a man. His clothes were torn, and his skin was pale under the harsh glare of the light. His arms were twisted at odd angles, like they had been broken. I knelt down, my hand shaking as I reached for his neck, hoping to find a pulse, praying this wasn't real. But before I could touch him, the man twitched, his arm jerked, and then his leg. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. His head turned toward me, his eyes snapping open, wide and glassy. He wasn't dead, but there was no life in those eyes. Just an empty, vacant stare. Are you alright? He didn't respond. He just stared at me, unmoving, his body still twisted and broken, but his eyes following me as I stepped away. There was no way he could have survived getting hit like that. No way he should still be moving. But there he was, just lying there, watching me. Suddenly, his mouth opened, and a low, raspy sound came out. It wasn't words, just a noise, like the wind scraping across the road. I turned and ran, stumbling back to the truck. I didn't care if he was alive or not. I just needed to get the hell out of there. I jumped into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared, and I threw the truck into gear, peeling out onto the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I sped away, expecting to still see him lying there. But the road behind me was empty. No sign of the man, no body, nothing. I drove straight through until morning, not stopping once. When I finally pulled into a rest area, I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself what had just happened. When I got out to check the truck for damage, there was a smear of blood on the front bumper, but no dents, no scratches, just blood. I've been back on that road a few times since then. Always at night, always alone. And every time I pass that stretch of the highway, I can't help but look in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting for someone else to stop. I had been driving trucks for almost a decade and thought I'd seen it all. Crazy weather, wild animals, sketchy people on the side of the road. But that night, rolling through the backwoods of West Virginia, I experienced something I can't explain. It was late, just past midnight, and the route I was taking was one I hadn't been on before. I was hauling a load of lumber, heading south. The road was narrow, winding through thick woods with no streetlights. My GPS told me there was a truck stop about 30 miles ahead, so I figured I'd pull in, get a coffee, and maybe take a quick nap. Suddenly, my CB radio crackled to life. I hadn't heard anything on it for hours, but now there was a static, and then a voice, faint but clear. "Breaker 19, anyone out there? This is Big Jake." I didn't recognize the handle, but I figured it was just another trucker in the area. I reached for the mic and responded, "This is Long Haul, go ahead, Big Jake." There was a pause, just static. Then the voice came back, sounding strained. I'm broke down, about 2 miles up the road. Need a hand." Something about his tone didn't sit right with me, but I wasn't about to leave a fellow trucker stranded. "Copy that, Big Jake. I'll keep an eye out for you." A couple miles down the road, I saw it. A rig was pulled over on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking faintly in the darkness. As I got closer, I noticed the truck looked old, like it had been sitting there for years. Faded paint, rust along the edges, and a trailer that sagged under its weight. I slowed down and pulled off behind it. The CB crackled again. "Thanks for stopping, Long Haul. Come on out, I could use some help." I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab. The air was thick, damp, with a heavy mist rolling through the trees. As I approached the truck, I noticed there was something off about it. The license plates were from a state I didn't recognize, and the tires were almost flat, like they hadn't moved in a long time. I walked up to the driver's door, but when I shined my lights inside, the cab was empty. No sign of Big Jake or anyone else. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. "Big Jake?" I called out, my voice sounding small in a thick silence. No response. Just the sound of the woods around me and the soft hum of my truck's engine behind me. Suddenly, the CB in my cab came back to life again. "I'm around back in the trailer. Come give me a hand." I turned, flashlight shaking in my grip. This didn't feel right. The voice had changed, deeper now, more insistent. I slowly walked to the back of the rig, my boots crunching on the gravel. The trailer's rear doors were closed, and as I got closer, I could see a thick layer of grime covering them. There was something scratched into the metal, letters, faint but visible. "Help." I backed away, my flashlight flickering. As I turned to head back to my truck, I heard a sound behind me, a low creak, like the trailer door slowly shifting open. "Come on, I need help," the voice whispered, but it wasn't coming from the CB anymore. It was closer, coming from inside of the trailer. I bolted. I didn't care who or what was back there. I jumped into my cab, slammed the door shut, and floored it. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The old truck sat there, motionless, its hazard lights still blinking faintly in the distance. My CB crackled again. "You should have helped, Long Haul." I ripped the mic off the dash and tossed it onto the floor. I didn't stop until I reached the truck stop, miles down the road. When I got inside, I asked the clerk if they'd heard of any breakdowns on the road that night. He shook his head. "Not tonight, but there's been a story around here for years. Old trucker named Big Jake broke down on that stretch of road back in the 1940s. Never made it home. They found his rig a week later, but he was gone. Some folks say his truck still shows up now and then, looking for someone to help him, or take his place." I didn't say a word, just grabbed my coffee, walked back to my truck, and drove through the rest of the night without stopping. I had been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, hauling everything from lumber to livestock across the country. There's something about the open road at night that either calms you down or messes with your head. I was on a long-haul trip, heading through the deep stretches of rural Wyoming. No cell phone service, barely any radio reception, just me, my rig, and the radio. It was around 2 a.m. when I noticed my fuel gauge dipping lower than expected. There was a rest stop about 50 miles out, and I figured I'd just make it there. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and I could see nothing but the faint outline of mountains in the distance. Every now and then, I'd pass an old farmhouse, its lights long since turned off. It was eerily quiet, except for the hum of my engine and the occasional creak of my rig. As I rounded a bend, my headlights picked up a figure on the side of the road. A woman, standing by an old, beat-up station wagon with the hood up. She waved, and though every instinct in me screamed to keep going, I slowed down to help. I'm not the kind of guy who leaves someone stranded, especially out here. I pulled over a few yards ahead of her, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, much colder than it had been just a few minutes ago. "Need some help?" I called out as I approached her. She didn't answer, just stood there, her back turned towards me. Something felt off. Her clothes were out of place, like she'd stepped out of the 1970s. A long, floral dress, hair tied into a messy bun. "Ma'am?" I said, stepping closer. That's when I noticed the car. It wasn't just old, it was ancient. Rusted through, tires flat, like it hadn't been driven in decades. My heart started to pound. I shone my flashlight on her again. She hadn't moved. I was about to turn back when she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's coming." My throat tightened. "Who's coming?" She didn't answer, just pointed down the road. I turned to look, but there was nothing. The road was empty, just as it had been. When I turned back, she was gone. Just gone. The car, the woman, everything vanished like they were never there. I sprinted back to my truck and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition, but the truck wouldn't start. Dead. I slammed my fists on the wheel, trying again and again, but nothing. The road outside was pitch black, and the temperature had dropped even more now. I could see my breath now, hanging in the air. Then, in my side mirror, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, flickering in the distance. But as it grew closer, taking shape, it was forming something tall, walking along the edge of the road, slowly getting closer. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze, watching me from the dark. It moved unnaturally, like it was floating just above the ground. I tried the ignition one last time, and finally, the engine roared to life. Without looking back, I floored it, my tires screeching as I sped off down the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, just watching me disappear into the night.